The gray mare stopped walking before Thomas Cord asked her to, and that was how he knew they had both run out of road. She stood at the edge of Millhaven, Kansas, on a cold October evening in 1850, her breath coming out in slow white clouds, her head low in the way of horses who have carried something heavy for too long and are quietly asking to be relieved of it. Thomas sat in the saddle for a long moment without moving, looking at the town the way a man looks at something he has no particular claim to, but no particular reason to avoid either. The sky behind him was the color of an old wound, deep red fading into purple, fading into the kind of darkness that comes early in autumn and stays late. A dog somewhere in the town barked once and went silent. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys in thin, pale lines. A child's wooden wagon sat abandoned in the middle of the dirt road, one wheel tilted sideways, as if its owner had simply stopped mid-play and wandered off towards something more important. Thomas looked at that wagon for a moment longer than necessary. Then he swung down from the saddle, his knees protesting the way they always did now, and led Dust slowly into Millhaven, without any particular plan, except to find water for the horse, and maybe, if God was feeling generous, something warm for himself. He was 53 years old, Thomas Cord. He had the kind of face that told you his age and then some, skin darkened and lined by 30 years of open sky, eyes the pale gray blue of creek water in February, a jaw carrying 2 weeks of silver stubble that he kept forgetting to address. He wore a long brown duster that once been a fine piece of clothing and now simply a faithful one, soft at the elbows and darkened at the hem from 1,000 different roads. His boots had seen more country than most men ever would. He had been a soldier once, young and straight-backed and full of something he would later understand was not courage, but simply the ignorance of consequences. He had fought in the Mexican-American War at 22, alongside men he loved like brothers, watched 2 of them die in the same afternoon in a field that had no name worth remembering, and come home to Missouri to find home had quietly become a place that no longer fit him the way it once had. His brother was gone, the farm felt like a coat belonging to someone else. So he had drifted, not without purpose, never without work, but without the thing that makes a place feel like yours. He had drifted for 30 years, and on this particular October evening, with Dust stopping of her own accord at the edge of a quiet Kansas town, he was beginning to wonder if drifting was simply what the rest of his life intended to be. He found the livery first and arranged water and feed for Dust with a few coins and a nod to the boy minding the place. Then he walked slowly back along the main road, his hands in his duster pockets, his breath fogging in the cold air, looking without urgency for a place that might sell him a meal. Most of the buildings were already shuttered for the evening. The general store was dark. A saloon at the far end of the road had light and noise, but Thomas had long since stopped finding comfort in that particular kind of warmth. He walked past it without slowing. It was at the far edge of the main road, set slightly back from the street behind a low fence and a small kitchen garden gone brown for the season, that he saw the house. It was modest, whitewashed board siding going gray at the edges, a porch with a rocking chair, a woodpile stacked against the side wall. What made him stop was the light. Every other building at that hour was going dark, drawing in, closing against the cold. But this house had warm gold light pouring from its kitchen window in a way that looked less like a lamp and more like something alive. He stood at the gate for a moment, not quite sure why he had stopped, not quite sure what he intended to do. Then the front door opened. She stood in the doorframe with a dish towel folded over her arm, backlit by that warm kitchen light, and she looked at him the way a sensible woman looks at a stranger at her gate on a cold evening, directly, without fear, but with clear and honest assessment. She was perhaps 50, perhaps a little younger, with dark hair pulled back and gray beginning at her temples. Her face was not the kind that painters chose for portraits, but it was the kind that stays with a person, open and steady, a face that had known real things and wasn't pretending otherwise. She studied him for a moment in the cold air between them. Then she said simply, "You look like you've been riding a long while." Thomas took his hat off. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him a moment more. The wind moved through the yard. "Have you eaten?" she asked. 3 words, spoken plainly, without performance, without the particular brightness of someone who wants to be seen being generous. Just a woman who looked at a tired man and asked the only question that was actually relevant. Thomas Cord, who had ridden through war and grief and 30 years of empty country, felt something shift in his chest at those 3 words in a way he could not have explained to anyone, including himself. His habit, built across decades of self-sufficiency, was to say he was fine, to take nothing, to keep moving. But his body was older than his habits now, and slower to cooperate with them. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I have not." She stepped back from the doorframe and said, "Then come in out of the cold." Her name was Clara Holt. She had been a widow for 4 years, since the January of 1847, when her husband Daniel had gone out into a hard winter storm to check on their cattle, and the storm had simply kept him. She had buried him in frozen ground behind the church, and then done what women of that time and place did without being asked. She had kept going. She kept the house, she kept the garden, she took in mending from the town and sold preserves in the summers, and kept a small flock of chickens that she spoke to sometimes in the evenings when the silence in the house pressed too heavily against her. She had one son, Samuel, working a cattle ranch in Texas, who wrote letters that sometimes arrived in pairs and sometimes not at all. She was not by nature a lonely woman, but loneliness had moved into the house anyway after Daniel, the way cold moves through walls, not through any single crack you can point to, just slowly, until you realize one morning that the temperature inside has changed. She fed Thomas at her kitchen table that evening, cornbread and pinto beans slow-cooked with salt pork and coffee strong enough to hold its own in an argument. She did not ask him his history or his business or where he was headed. She asked him if he wanted more coffee, and when he nodded, she poured it, and they sat in the warmth of the kitchen with the wood stove clicking steadily, and the wind pressing at the shutters, and the oil lamp throwing its soft gold light across the table between them. He told her a few things without being asked, that he had come from Dodge, that he was looking for work, that he knew horses the way some men knew scripture, by long necessity and something close to love. She listened in the way that had become rare in Thomas Cord's experience, not preparing her next words while he spoke, but actually listening, her hands resting quiet on the table, her eyes steady on his face. "You served," she said at one point. It was not quite a question. "Long time ago," he said. She nodded once, as if that answered something she had been wondering about, not the war itself, but the particular quality of stillness he carried, the way a man holds himself when he has learned that the world can change completely between one breath and the next. He left that night and slept in the livery. He found work the next morning at a cattle operation east of town, run by a rancher named Aldous Pratt, who needed a man who understood horses and didn't require explaining things to twice. Thomas was both. He moved into the bunkhouse and told himself that was the end of it. He had eaten at a kind woman's table, and that was a grace to be grateful for and not to overreach. But on the fourth evening, walking back through town in the last cold light, he passed her house and saw her struggling alone on the side of the property, trying to restack a wood pile that had shifted and collapsed against the fence. He stopped at the gate. She looked up. Neither of them said anything that wasn't necessary. He came through the gate and spent the better part of an hour restacking the wood properly, heaviest logs at the bottom, the smaller pieces fitted in tight against the weather, while she held the lantern without being asked to. When it was done, she looked at the neat stack and then at him and said, "Come inside. I have soup on the stove." Not a question. He came inside. That became the shape of things. He came by on evenings when work permitted. She had something on the stove. He found things around the property that needed tending. A hinge going loose, a fence post leaning at the wrong angle, a porch step that groaned dangerously on its left side and had been waiting too long for someone to address it. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped needing to impress each other, slowly, with comfortable silences between, like two people walking a trail that is wide enough for both of them without either one needing to lead. One evening by the wood stove, she told him about the morning they found Daniel, about how her hands had trembled for a month afterward completely without her permission. She said it plainly, without asking for anything in response. Thomas listened with the particular stillness he gave to horses, patient, fully present, without looking away. "I kept thinking I heard him come in at night," she said quietly, looking at the stove rather than at Thomas. "For nearly a year, I'd wake up thinking I heard the door." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the people we lose don't leave all at once." Clara looked at him then. "No," she said softly, "they don't." In early December, a letter arrived from Texas. Samuel had been injured on a cattle drive. A horse had come down badly, and his leg was broken in 2 places. He was healing, the letter said, but he would not be coming home for Christmas as he had promised in October. Clara read the letter alone at the kitchen table after Thomas had gone for the evening, and sat with it in her hands in the dark for a long time without lighting another lamp. She was the kind of woman who handled the practical things first and cried privately afterward when the necessary work was done. But the house felt very large that night, and the quiet had a different quality than usual, heavier, less like peace, and more like absence. She did not mention the letter when Thomas came by 2 days later, but he saw it in her, in the slight tightness around her eyes, in the way she moved through the kitchen a little more carefully than usual, as though she was concentrating on each small task to keep her attention from going somewhere else. He said nothing directly. But when he rose to leave that evening, he paused at the door and said, without looking back at her, "I don't care much for sitting in a bunkhouse on Christmas. If it wouldn't be an imposition, I'd like to come by that morning." There was a brief silence behind him. Then Clara said, "It wouldn't be an imposition, Thomas." And the way she said it told him everything she wasn't saying. Christmas morning came in pale and cold, with a thin skin of snow on the ground that caught the early light and threw it back silver white across the empty fields. Thomas arrived with an armload of firewood he had cut himself the day before, and a small paper bag of good coffee beans he had traded for in town. Clara had made biscuits and fried salt pork, and there was a small pine bough on the table with a red ribbon tied around it that she had clearly done herself, simply, without fuss. They ate together in the warm kitchen, mostly quiet, the kind of quiet that has stopped needing to be filled. At some point during the meal, Thomas looked across the table at her, at the steadiness in her hands, at the patience that lived in her face, at the way the morning light came through the kitchen window and settled on her as though it knew where it was welcome, and understood something he had been quietly understanding for weeks without allowing himself to name it. He did not say any of that on Christmas morning. He was a slow man with words, always had been, and he knew that some things needed more time to find their right shape before they were spoken. But when he rose to leave, he stood at the door and said quietly, "I'm grateful for your company, Clara, more than I know how to say properly just yet." She looked at him with those clear, honest eyes and said, "You've got time to find the words." And he knew by the steadiness in her voice that she was not sending him away. Spring returned to Millhaven the way it always did on the Kansas plains, slowly, stubbornly, with cold nights pushing back against warm afternoons, and the ground going soft and dark and new again after months of frost. Thomas Cord did not leave. He had spoken with Aldous Pratt about staying on permanently, and Pratt, who trusted Thomas with his finest horses by now, agreed without negotiation. Thomas spent his Sunday afternoons at Clara's property, not only repairing things now, but building a proper woodshed so the logs would stay dry through the worst weather, a new gate for the kitchen garden, a stronger railing for the porch. He did these things without being asked, and without expecting anything beyond what was already freely given: supper, conversation, and the quiet warmth of being somewhere that had begun without announcement to feel like the place he was supposed to be. Samuel arrived in June, a broad young man of 26, still favoring his healed leg slightly, who looked at Thomas Cord with the careful eyes of a son taking the measure of a man who has been spending time with his mother. Thomas met his gaze directly and offered his hand, and did not try to explain himself or win anything. He shook Samuel's hand, said it was good to meet him, and left mother and son to their reunion. But the following Sunday, when Thomas came for supper, Samuel was at the table, and by the end of the meal, he was asking Thomas about horsebreaking with the genuine interest of a young man who recognizes real knowledge when he sits across from it. By summer's end, they had ridden out together twice to look at difficult horses, and a quiet, unspoken respect had settled between them that neither man needed to put into words. In September of 1851, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening with no occasion attached to it, Thomas Cord sat beside Clara Holt on her porch as the last of the daylight left the sky, and asked her in plain and careful words if she would allow him to stay. Not just for evenings, not just for Sundays, properly, permanently. He said he knew he was not a young man and had no extravagant things to offer, but he knew how to be steady, and he had learned in this past year that steadiness, given freely and without condition, was perhaps the most valuable thing one person could bring to another. He said that this porch, this kitchen, this woman, this was the place his life had been moving toward through all those long years of drifting, without him knowing it. Clara was quiet for a long moment in the way she was always quiet when something truly mattered. Then she said, "I asked you once if you'd eaten." A pause and something close to a smile. "I didn't expect you'd still be here a year later." She looked at him steadily. "I'm glad you are, Thomas." And that was as close to yes as Clara Holt needed to come, and Thomas Cord understood it as completely as he had ever understood anything in his life. The lantern on the porch burned warm and steady that evening against whatever wind came across the Kansas plain. 2 chairs sat side by side where there had long been only one. The kitchen garden was being put to bed for winter, the woodshed was full, and somewhere out in the dark field down the road, a horse moved quietly through the grass. Millhaven went on being the kind of town that forgot people slowly, but it would not forget these two. A man who had finally stopped moving, a woman who had kept her light burning, not out of waiting, but out of faithfulness to the life she still had left in her. They had found each other not through any grand or dramatic event, but in the simplest, most quietly miraculous way, across a kitchen table, over a question as small and as enormous as 3 plain words spoken on a cold October evening. "Have you eaten?" And in the warmth of that kitchen, in the steadiness of that lantern, in the silence that had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like home, two people who had walked a long time in cold country discovered what the human heart has always known and sometimes needs reminding, that it is never too late to come in out of the cold. That kindness, offered without condition, is the most powerful force a person can put into the world, and that home is not always the place you were born. Sometimes it is the place where someone, without knowing what they were beginning, simply turned on the light and asked if you were hungry. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that the smallest acts of kindness can change the entire direction of a life, please take a moment and subscribe to Desert Heart. Every week we bring you stories like this one, quiet and honest and true to the best of what people can be. Press that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. You are not just a viewer on this channel. You are part of something, a community that believes the human heart, no matter how long it has been walking in difficult country, still knows how to find its way home. We will see you in the next story. Let the music carry what the words have already built. This story holds meaningful value on several levels. It honors the quiet dignity of aging and the particular courage it takes to remain open to love and connection after loss. It gives respectful voice to the veteran experience, not the battlefield, but the long aftermath, the years of carrying invisible weight and learning to put it down. It shows grief not as something to be conquered, but as something that becomes part of a person and can, with time and the right presence, coexist peacefully with new joy. It offers a portrait of love in later life that is wiser and more honest than the love of youth, built not on passion or urgency, but on steadiness, respect, and the willingness to simply show up. It models healthy human connection, no manipulation, no grand gestures, just presence and consistency and care freely given. For older American audiences, it offers something rare and valuable, a mirror in which their own quiet struggles are reflected back with full dignity. For younger audiences, it offers a portrait of what real character looks like in a human being. The 1850s frontier setting adds historical richness, grounding the story in a time when survival itself demanded community, and when small acts of kindness carried a weight that people in harder times understood instinctively. At its heart, this story is a case for showing up, quietly, faithfully, and without asking anything in return. That is a lesson worth carrying in any century.